You are listening to American Wag. American Wag. Where the mind is respected and the truth is sometimes detected.
How you doing this day, Mark?
I'm okay. I'm worried about the state of the world.
The state of the world.
But what's interesting is there's this great song I've been hearing on satellite radio by, I think, Lucas Nelson, who's Willie Nelson's kid.
Oh, wow.
And it's called Turn Off the News and Love Your Children.
Good one.
And it's one of these things that sort of brings into sharp relief the idea that the real lives that most of us lead are very different than the lives in the kind of world of marketplace and news and Twitter and Facebook and all that.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. There's FOMO, I think, is the new acronym for fear of missing out.
Yeah.
Which is when people take the best parts of their lives and post pictures on Facebook so that they look like.
They also take the worst part of their lives.
That too. That's scary.
And so it's one of these things where it's useful to kind of look at the world and remind oneself that it's nothing like what you're really seeing in the newspaper or on the news or on Facebook or online.
Yeah, that's a good idea as long as you believe that there is truth out there.
Well, but I think what you've got to look at is you've got to look at what's your daily lived experience versus what you read about.
Mm.
And when your daily lived experience and what you read about are wildly different, you know.
But that's also, I mean, I remember growing up here, and I went to New York, and my experience was completely different. If somebody would ask me a question about life in Los Angeles, I would remember the same 6 or 7 stories. So I would be stereotyping my life because there would be things that I say that I experienced, and I would misremember them because I didn't have video at the time. I remember, for example, when there was when Eric Garcetti was a DA, he's now the mayor. But this may be, she's 20 years ago, maybe even more. There was some kid who got his head slammed on a car hood, black kid, by the white cops. And Garcetti says he's going to get to the bottom of this. And I can remember being a kind of guerrilla reporter and running around looking for cops doing that. And I could swear I saw it all the time. I see black kids handcuffed at the curb all the time. And it turns out that we just remember them because they impact our lives more than they actually happen.
Well, but it's also that we tend to weave stories out of fragments of memory. And the stories we weave tend to be ones that kind of confirm our beliefs about the world.
Right. So our lived experience, what we remember of our lived experience, see, we have to face that truth on Thanksgiving every year.
But what's nice is, and it's sort of like, you know, I'm a big believer in, you know, being in the moment if you can, at least a little bit all the time. That's why
Ghost dog.
I love riding motorcycles, right? Because you're in the moment when you do it, or you're dead. And the idea of being in the moment is to look at the world as it is, not as you wish or hope or fear it to be.
Right.
And I think we're doing a terrible job of that right now.
We're buying too many lottery tickets.
Well, partly. And I think the other thing we're doing is we are... And this gets to kind of the topic for the day, which to me is sort of white nationalism, because I think that's one of the important kind of issues in the moment. And what we are doing is we all buy things as sort of a tribal indicator, right? Respectfully, your watch, your Apple Watch, is a symbol of a membership in a certain tribe, right? My Garmin fitness watch is a symbol of a membership in a tribe. I've literally had people walk up and go, "Oh, you've got a Phoenix. What sport do you do?" Right, and so there are all these little tribal kind of indicia that we buy into.
Air Jordans,
right? Whatever, right? Every tribe has their stuff.
True.
And so, what we're looking at is the notion of we're tribalizing truth in a very scary way.
I think part of that is inevitable because one of my enduring theories is that we really don't know outside of an oppressive empire how to govern more than 150 million people.
Okay, I mean,
and so you have to let it slack off unless you're going to be authoritarian. And you say, let these people, in the North do this, and there's a
Well,
Game
that's
of Thrones all the time.
No, it is.
Everybody has their own tribal and regional loyalties.
No, they absolutely do, and they differ, and there's tension between them, and that tension probably isn't a bad thing. But I think that the idea of, tribal truths is important. I think the idea of, remembering certain things in context, right? I was present when a kid got his face slammed into the hood of a car, right? Happened to be a white kid.
Mm-hmm.
We were on Mulholland Drive at 2 in the morning, right? Street racing.
What were you doing on Mulholland Drive at 2 in the morning?
Street racing, of course. And, this kid and I stop, and we're sort of, kicking tires and talking after driving back and forth a couple times. Mm-hmm. And cop car, 2 cops pulls up, they get out, one cop takes me, the other cop takes the other kid. The cop is standing with me by my car, and he and I are having kind of a sane conversation, because I'm, I got told by my, and actually it's interesting, because one of the lessons I got from my black uncles, right, the guys that I spent time with as a kid was, with a cop it's yes sir, no sir, how can I help you, sir?
Yeah.
Right, and there's no ifs, ands, buts. Whereas my sort of rich white friends were like, "Fuck you, cop, you worked for me," right? And I'm like, "Yes sir," and I'm yes sirring this cop up and down both sides. And the cop is like, "You're a smart kid. Like, why are you doing this? Like, what are you doing up here? You're gonna die. You're gonna kill somebody. School bus full of nuns. The whole conversation." Right. And I'm talking to him about it, and we're having kind of a reasonable conversation. And all of a sudden, the other cop, who's maybe 10 yards away, grabs the other guy, wheels around, and goes donk on the hood of the police car. And my cop looks at me, and I'm like, "Tell me what you want me to do."
Yeah.
And he's like, "Stand here, shut up." And I'm like,
It's interesting. I had a reasonable conversation with a cop about 12 years ago.
Yeah.
And there were several that I'm sure I had over my lifetime. But this one was like, we saw you coming out of Bank of America, and there was a bank robbery just around the corner here. And I said, well, lots of people try to look like me. And I had my wife's car, which still had Detroit plates because we bought it new in Detroit.
Right.
And, you mind if I search your car? Yeah. And I open up the back, and he sees baby stuff. And,
right.
But it was really weird. I wrote a really long essay about that day. It was actually the day that Neil Stephenson's Reamdy came out.
Okay.
That book.
That was not that long ago.
Yeah, it wasn't. It was. Yeah, the new Neil Stephenson book was out,
yeah.
and I got pulled over at Del Amo.
So the interesting question is, and you and I've talked about this a little bit, that as a black guy, your interactions with cops are fundamentally different. And
yes and no.
And as knowing somebody who knows a lot of cops, right, and has hung out and done ride-alongs and done all this sort of happy stuff with them, my sense of it is, and it's my sense, I don't think there's any sociologically valid kind of argument here yet, because is that cops do sort of a rapid scan and stereotyping on everybody they interact with.
Yep.
And there's 2 Michael David Cobb Bowens.
Yep.
Right? There's Michael David Cobb Bowen from Crenshaw, who ran with, which Crenshaw gang was Rolling 60s Crenshaw?
No, that was too far south.
Okay.
We had West Side.
Okay, with West Side.
Yeah.
Right? And dropped out of junior college and has worked a bunch of random jobs and has 5 kids by 4 different women and lives that life, which is
Pookie, Mountain, Boo, Nudie, Suitcase.
Right.
Those are the guys I used to run with.
Real people.
Yeah.
Right? And their interactions with cops and their reactions to cops are very different. And there's Redondo Beach, Michael David Cobb Bowen, who's a high-end business intelligence and computer technology engineer.
With the Apple Watch.
Right, with an Apple Watch. And, kids who go to college and have cool jobs and that whole life. And that guy's a whole different person. And the problem is...
Yeah, and the police departments are different too. But the police, when my brother became LAPD about 17 years ago, we had a lot of discussions about, what's it like? You're a cop now. Tell me what the cops know. And the first thing he said is, number 1 rule is, you are enforcing the law, so you cannot lose. You don't let anybody get away with it.
Right.
All right? And what he said, another thing that people don't understand is that police are trying to minimize what they have to deal with. All right? So he says, I am not judging your entire life. This was today, at this moment, I saw this suspect doing this thing,
Right.
and you are accountable to that. And that's it. They're not trying to judge your whole other life, but they will judge if you're being an asshole, if
That's
you're
right.
not going to be cooperative.
That's right.
All right? Because then a cop has two choices. Either he has to take you down personally by himself,
Mm-hmm.
which is the worst case scenario, or he's going to have to call for backup.
Right.
And they don't want to have to do that because what cops don't want to do is they don't want to get injured themselves because a fight can go any way.
Anyway, yeah.
Especially when the cop's got
Mhm.
a gun and a baton on him. It's like, so he can either, and cops are authorized to use one level of force more than what you
Right.
present.
Right.
So the more you present, the more you're
It
going to
escalate. No, it's gonna escalate fast. And
because cops can't lose.
look, I mean, I've got a story about it, and I won't go into great detail to protect the guilty, but white collar crime, right? White, prosperous guy, worked at a university, stole like $1 million worth of gear, and it was arguably not so much to steal it as a personal beef. A friend of mine arrested the guy in his high-rise apartment.
Nice.
And the guy was like, F you, I'm not opening the door. The manager opens, we have a warrant, open the door, the manager opens the door, guy's F you, I'm not cooperating. They're like, you're going to cooperate or we're going to send you to jail.
Right.
And it escalates.
Mm-hmm.
And the guy wound up spending like a month in central jail.
Yeah.
Right? And he's this white upper middle class guy, so I'm sure it wasn't a good time for him.
Happens all the time.
And basically, had he simply been not an asshole.
It's true. It's funny because a year or so ago, the notorious rap producer Suge Knight
Yeah.
was arrested for attempted murder, I think it was.
Yeah. When he hit somebody with a car, if I remember right.
Yeah, yeah. And they filmed the whole arrest. And the guy just said, got down
Yeah.
his hands. I said, this is how a real criminal gets arrested. Because they know the system.
Right, they know the game, and I'm not going to take a beating for this.
Right.
And so, what you've got? Let me cycle back for a minute because what you've got is a dynamic where cops are paid to do this, and I think that one of the things that people talk about is how cops become a very insular blue tribe, and within the blue tribe you've got fragments, and there are absolutely racist cops. I know some of them.
There's racist to everybody.
There's racist to everybody. And I think that the issue is that you've got to sort out what's the very marginal behavior. We got a country of 350 million people.
Yeah.
At this given moment, at the time that we're making this video or somebody's watching it,
Anything's happening.
everything you can imagine is happening in this country
Exactly.
right now.
Exactly.
Now, it may only be happening twice,
But it's happening.
but it's happening. And
Yeah.
so the issue is, at what point does something become an issue as opposed to statistical noise?
Well, I mean, that is, I approach this whole thing as not academic, but as practical.
Yeah.
I mean, I the Bachelor of Science track.
Yeah.
I'm the Star Trek nerd, computer science guy, Lord of the Rings, all that stuff. So for me, I was trying to understand what you liberal arts lawyers and those guys think.
Yeah.
What the drama majors were all about. I mean, are you guys really actually thinking? So my whole life, part of my life has been a project to understand the arts, to understand the humanities, to understand how that kind of thinking goes. And so as part of that, yeah, I want to look at sociology. Like my parents were sociologists, but I want to look at the arts, and I want to understand this other way of thinking, of the other logic when you're trying to deal with people. And
So
all
it's
that
not
stuff.
just art. I mean, one of the things about art that's amazing, and I had a professor who taught political theory through literature. Right, we're talking about America, and we read Moby Dick.
Right.
And what good art does is it tells a truth about stuff in the form of this crazy story.
Right.
And so, I think that going out and doing that doesn't just give you access to kind of a certain set of perceptions, but if you do it right and take it in the right way, it gives you access to something that you'd never get to otherwise.
Right. And I think somehow the best of that art becomes a substitute for individual experience.
And
Okay, because if you came from Ames, Iowa,
yep,
and you don't know what a black community is like,
yeah,
and you step into the jungle in Baldwin Hills,
Yep.
right next to
I know where it is.
you have no idea what this is. This only exists as a mythical world to you.
But you saw Training Day, and the problem is,
Right.
But see, the
And
problem
Training Day is good art, and it makes a point.
But we construct, but the issue is we construct the reality partly out of these fragments of art that we consume.
Mm-hmm.
So this ties back to something, and I really do want to kind of drill on this issue of white nationalism for a minute. I mean, I know people who I consider racist, right? And to me, what racism is about is what do you do in your daily life, right? If I have a black server in a restaurant, do I tip them less? Am I rude to them?
Right.
Right? If I'm a white server and I have a black table, right? Do I spill stuff? Kind of. Do you know what I mean? But it's just sort of like one of these things of do I act out in the world
Yeah.
around my axis and perception of people's race.
Right.
And the break happens here when you look at. So I had an argument online, like I do often,
Not you.
with a very liberal kind of ex-friend. Somebody we finally just gave up on each other. And this guy basically was like, Mark, you're like borderline racist. And I'm like, look, and I go, okay, so I got a question. In your daily life, like how many African American people have been in your house that you weren't paying to do something? Right? How many African American people work for you?
Right.
How many African American people do you work for?
Right.
And do you work with? Right? When you socialize or go to your bowling leagues or whatever the hell you do for fun, poetry circles, how many people of color are there?
Right.
And and he's like, well, that's not relevant. I go, it's entirely relevant.
Yeah, because it's who you choose to represent.
Well, but it's more than that. It's sort of like
there's this authentical thing. I mean, my generation pushed this. All right, we're responsible for saying, pay attention to the black experience.
Yeah.
And I grew up like, pay attention to my black experience. And there is the art that says it right. All right. Before Toni Morrison wrote Beloved,
Yep.
The Bluest Eye was it. All right. And then Zora Neale Hurston,
Yeah.
Their Eyes Were Watching God. And I didn't personally relate to those stories. But when I read Beloved, I got what I was looking for in black literature. The point is, if you don't have a lot of black people in your life, you don't know a lot of different kind of black people. And so the art represents in your mind.
Sure.
Or maybe Ice Cube on MTV represents in your mind. And part of the problem with race today in America is everybody feels that they kind of represent, or that they have to conform to a certain kind of authentic representation.
See, I don't think everybody feels that. I think that if you were to scoop up 100,000 people within 10 miles of us and sample that 100,000 people, 1,000 of them would feel that way.
Right, and the rest would shut up.
And the rest are like, whatever, I
And
just
you
go
would
about my
you
life.
would only hear the 1,000.
But it's not
and
even
that's
that.
the point.
But that's not that they're shutting up. They're just not. They're not involved in this conversation because they're busy raising their kids and
Right,
and doing life. And so the issue becomes the people who are sort of super focused on this conversation from one perspective or another.
Right.
Are the voices you hear.
Right.
And we then assume that the entire building is full of those people.
Yes.
And my point kind of is that I want to draw this sharp distinction between what you live, what you say, right, and what you think and believe about the world.
Well, I think that makes perfect sense. But sooner or later, somebody has a "my daddy told me" story, or equally valid is my religion and my minister says this.
Right.
And so what I've actually tried to do, because I did the race man thing, because actually I grew up as a black nationalist,
Right.
and there's a whole interesting story there,
Yeah.
is how do I tell the same story to everybody? How do I understand what these arts folks have been doing, but come from it with a scientific discipline,
Yeah.
from a logical place? And I'll tell you what happened, and I'm going to go on a little bit. I read this book when I moved to New York. I was about 31 years old. by a guy named K. Anthony Appiah. And Appiah was basically West African royalty.
Okay.
His parents were running a country.
Okay.
So he knew Kwame Nkrumah and the Nkrumah clan, that family. And so he said, from an African who was involved in the Pan-Africanism movement, what's wrong with racial thinking? How come these things fail? How come we're still talking about Nat Turner? How come we're still talking about the guy who did the African Star, Marcus Garvey? How come we're still talking about Frederick Douglass? Why did not their plans work out? And he got it down to this guy who we don't know, but his name was Alexander Crummell. And he was like the first black thinker. Okay, in that Africans paid attention to and Americans paid attention to.
Rough timeline.
I don't know where Crummell was around, but bottom line is, Appiah said, "I've watched the corruption from the black nationalist side.
Yeah.
I've seen what happens when the black thinking. Everybody says Kwame Nkrumah is, or Haile Selassie is, and then that is the authentic black, and you now have to be the authentic black."
Right.
And that works exactly the same thing when Stalin says, "This is the authentic Soviet." And you need to be
Or
authentic.
Hitler says you're the authentic Aryan.
And so when in Nigeria they have a civil war, Igbo against the others, it's like we're the right blacks and you're not the right blacks. And so he says there's an error in this racial thinking everywhere. And here's how you understand it. So the first thing is you start with the premise of racialism. So you say, is this racial? And racialism says human beings are kind of like dogs. You can breed them a certain way, and certain ones will be evil, and certain ones will be sexy dogs, the poodle, and some will be, lovable. And so you have to believe that there's an essence of, let's say, the essence of the Jew, or the essence of the Arab, or the essence of the West African, that is their specific message to the world. These people have a message to the world. They embody this virtue that only they have. So you have to take humanity as a pie and split up the pie. And each pie is a race, and each race has a combination. Okay? So maybe the German has the ultimate logic. And if you want to learn mathematics, you have to learn from the Germans.
Yeah, but is that genetic racial, or is that culture racial? Is that what historic
the
racial?
point is you call it race, and you identify with it that way.
Okay, so it's an idea, it's a concept.
It's a concept that says that is a race.
Okay.
So human beings all have these races, and each race has a certain property. And you can trace that, and it's inherited. And that's in your bloodline. There's nothing you can do about it. All right. Now, if you're just what I would call a racialist, okay, so that's a new term that almost nobody uses here in the States. That just means I believe in that. I believe that theory of race explains something about human nature. Okay? And if you look at Jared Diamond, Guns, Germs, and Steel, part of what he does is just demolishes that. He says that's how everybody used to think, that it was in the blood. Okay, but we know it's other things. We know he names some specific environment things. All right. So the racialists may think, there's maybe 30 races, not 4, maybe 6, maybe 8. We may get better with the science, but we'll know it's going to be a racial thing. It's not particularly controversial. I may be friends with you. I'm not racist, but I believe race is real. That there is a scientific construction, a social construction, a religious construction, but there's something about race, and if you don't talk about somebody's race, you're missing an essential part of their humanity. Okay?
That's interesting. I haven't thought about that. Okay.
So you're saying race is real, and it means something all the time through history, like that. Now, the interesting thing is, my new thing is, I said that what you're talking about is psychology, and that's actually scientific, and we still haven't perfected it yet. So maybe what you think is race is actually psychology.
Yeah, but there's one of the things that's going on that's interesting now is we're beginning to understand much more how much of psychology is biologically driven.
That's true.
And so, to some arguable extent, right? Because, certain groups of people share a common biological lineage going back 100 generations or something. You know, you could make the claim that we've differentiated somewhat biologically, and therefore that whatever influence biology has on psychology, we get different psychologies, but I'm kind of terrified by that thought.
But that's not where we are in our contemporary lives.
Right.
Because we will say socioeconomics, race, gender, sexual preference, political party.
Yeah.
That's about as deep as we go. Those same 5 factors. Given 1,000 things you can do to categorize people,
Yeah.
we still leave it at those big high level blocks. But let's go beyond that. So let's say you accept this premise of racialism. All right?
Where are you going?
Susie's?
Oh, okay.
Oh, okay. I have a favorite hamburger joint that's called Simsey's.
No. They're going to my sister-in-law's house.
All right. So let's say you accept this premise of racialism.
Right.
And it's not controversial. You're just like, you're white folks, I'm black folks.
Yeah.
I have the average amount of black consciousness. It doesn't mean anything to me, but it's real and it's unavoidable.
Yeah.
And I always have to bring it up at some point. Okay? So everybody has a racial identity, right? It's a given because this idea of race exists. So you have this identity whether you like it or not.
Right.
And some people will say it's more real, and some people will try to represent it more, and some people will say, it's not that important to me. All right? So you can still believe in this racialism and not be a racist. You can just say, it's not controversial, I'm not going to make anything out of it, but you're a Ford and I'm a Chevy. Right?
And
you can't be the same thing.
Well, and so the argument becomes that, you select on the differences to look for.
Yeah.
And the differences that matter. And the question is, how much does it matter? And I guess...
How much do you want to make it matter?
Well, that's part of it,
Okay.
right? We anchor on things that we want to make matter. But it's also sort of one of these things where you want to do we can't do an experiment, right? I can't randomly select 1 million kids around the world, move them to different parents,
Right.
and see what happens.
Right. But that's what I kind of loved about, if you go watch Do the Right Thing again,
Yeah.
Spike Lee zooms the camera in on somebody, and it's like what's a Turturro?
Yeah.
In the pizza shop.
Yeah.
You spear chucking mooly and you can get somebody to say what they actually believe.
Yeah.
But we hardly ever do that. We just say, you're a racist. You did this thing that I think is racist, that means you're a racist. But you never ask the person, well, what do you actually believe?
But see, it's not a question of how you believe. I mean, I think that the argument is, it's not a matter of the thing you say when you're the angriest or the closest to, to losing control. Right? I think because what happens is when you're angry and you lose control, you just anchor on whatever you can insult somebody for.
Yeah.
Right? You bearded so-and-so.
Yeah. You
know what I mean? Right, you neckbeard. I still don't know why that's an insult, but we'll talk about that. But it's like one of these things where it's sort of, I don't think about that. I really want to look at sort of like in the course of your regular life, I want to go back to this anchoring in regular life.
All right. So
Because,
let's take the next step. So that's racialism.
Yeah.
If you're a racist, you have to believe in racialism.
Yeah.
You have to believe it.
And it has to be the dominant factor in your life.
Well, let's look at it, because there's 3 degrees. I'm going to say there's 3 degrees, or the German, there's 3 degrees of racism. So let's say the soft racist.
Okay.
Soft racist says, or what's the stereotype? Asians are better in math.
Right.
And they have, and the women are sexy and the guys are not.
Okay.
So, yeah, I can accept that, and that's what Appia would call an extrinsic racist.
Okay.
Okay, he says, but I can still be friends with him.
Mm-hmm.
I believe these things, and I believe it warrants a different way of treating them.
Yeah.
Okay? But I can be friends with them.
Okay.
All right? And if there's a Asian guy that's actually studly, well, I can accept Bruce Lee.
Right.
He's an exception to the Asian rule, okay? Because he's not a math wizard and he's not a doctor, right?
Right.
All right, so I can accept that. I can accept that. And I can accept that there may be unattractive Asian women.
Right.
Okay? And I may accept that there's maybe Connie Chung. She has social skills.
Yeah.
Unlike all the rest of the Asians. All right, so that's your Archie Bunker bigot, right?
Right.
There's soft. They're not necessarily saying it's controversial. They say they can accept. So, but they're always going to make a
They're
note.
looking for a differentiator.
There's an exception.
Yeah.
All right. You are this, but you're exceptional that.
Okay.
All right. So that's a soft racism. All right. And when you talk about the bigotry of low expectations on all that, that's exactly, we get that all the time.
Okay.
All right. That is racist.
We get that all the time.
We, meaning America, sees that all the time.
Right. Okay.
And Americans say, well, that's racist.
Right.
All right. And people understand that.
Right.
All right. Now let's say you're a hard racist. Hard racist says it doesn't matter. You're black. You should be treated like all of blacks. All right.
Right. The only thing that matters about you is that you're black.
Well, not only that, but it's just like, not only can you not escape this, but you have to answer to the other blacks. All right. We need a black leader to straighten out all the blacks.
Okay.
Because I can't do this as long as the black people are like that.
Right. As long as there's one black person who is not free, I'm not free.
You have to clean up your black on black crime.
Right.
All right. And those are the people who think it's like it's really funny, the racist jokes.
See, I don't think. I mean, it's funny because I've got a whole different perception of hard racists. Hard racists that I've known would do things like pull into a store, walk in, and if the cashier was black, walk out.
Yeah. That's a pretty hard racist.
Right? I mean,
Right.
that's where my head goes when it's somebody who's racist.
Right. Now we get finally to the supremacist.
Right.
Okay, so 3 levels of racism: the soft racist, the
Hardened
bigot,
supremacist.
then the supremacist. The supremacist says, I'm not comfortable with my life until this these status
This
of
messy
the race
this messy
is
stuff
done.
we've got.
All right.
Yeah.
He reinterprets history of the world as a conflict between pure racists with the mongrels in the middle. All right. They want a reconciliation, a righteous reconciliation of the racists in the world. All right. The hard racist says your race has a destiny. The supremacist says we got to make that destiny happen now.
Yeah.
All right. And the world is going to come apart unless there is a revolution or a reconciliation or something between these races. Because race is the most important problem in the world. And until...
But see, the supremacist isn't so much making racial issues supreme, but they try and make a race supreme.
Absolutely. If you're a hard racist, you believe in inferior and superior races.
Right.
All right? But you may not necessarily be about that. All right? But a supremacist says, I'm about that.
Right. I'm bringing that into my life.
I'm going to make that happen.
I'm going to live that.
I'm going to be the person that makes that happen.
And it's interesting because that ties to my theory, because what it's about now is I've got some beliefs, and now I take the beliefs and I take them a little more seriously, and now I'm going to live these beliefs.
That's what supremacists.
And I think kind of the argument that I make about the times is that there's absolutely white supremacists and black supremacists and probably yellow and brown supremacists out there in the world. They've historically in the U.S. been, and when I say historically, I'm talking about in my lifetime. I'm not talking about going back into the 20s and 30s. Been an irrelevant number of people. Like there was a state change in the 60s that we went through.
Yeah.
And a bunch of people were like, oh, okay, that didn't happen.
It was gradual, but yeah.
Yeah. And, well, it was rapid historically. It was gradual personally.
Yeah. Well, I would say the Red Tails had something to do with it.
Yeah, I think the Red Tails had a lot to do with it. I think all this stuff, all this stuff had a lot to do with it. There's a classic line that can't think of the name of the show because I don't watch TV. There was a TV show in the 80s about a gay guy and a woman who were housemates.
Yeah. Don't remember.
Help me out.
Will and Grace.
Thank you. Yes.
And that was in the 90s.
Okay.
Pretty sure.
Whatever, right? and I had a friend who's sort of a gay activist who basically said that he believed that Will and Grace had done more to advance the cause of gay rights than any amount of activism, any amount of political change. Because all of a sudden people were seeing a gay guy on TV and laughing and was just sort of a normal guy who was funny, except that he liked to sleep with guys.
That's funny. Because I used to watch Bosom Buddies and I thought Tom Hanks was gay.
Okay.
Remember Buddy Buddies?
Never seen it.
Oh my God!
Never seen it.
Sunny.
Nothing. I got nothing.
All right, here's the premise.
No.
Tom Hanks and Peter Scolari.
No,
Okay.
we're not going down
But
this.
anyway, yeah.
So the you know, the sense that I have is that white supremacists have been historically a very small group.
Mm-hmm.
But one of the things I've talked about it is that I think that the people that they attract are some of the scariest people you're going to meet. There have been very, very few times I've been scared to be in a room with somebody. Right? I walked into a restaurant one day, and there were and there's a group within the Hells Angels. I don't know who they are, but they have the SS insignia as sort of their logo. And there were 3 of these guys at a table, and I kind of walk into the room, dumb, friendly me, you know, and I'm like, ding, 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 alert, 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 and I'm looking at these 3 guys, and I'm like, I'm actually kind of scared of these guys.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And they sort of look up at me and ignore me and look back to their meal, and they're talking. And I'm like, am I going to back out of the room? Fuck it, I'm going to go sit, but I'm going to sit as far away as I can facing them, right? And those guys were white, pale hair, you know, hard guys who I would believe in my heart of hearts would be more than happy to sort of, you know, to put you in a barrel and roll you out to sea.
Yeah.
And they exist, and they're scary as fuck.
Yeah. It's interesting. I remember reading Derek Bell, who was the first tenured at Harvard, Faces at the Bottom of the Well. And he said, here's a scenario. Because what he did was he gave us multiple ways to think about race.
Yeah.
And one of the scenarios was, and when he wrote the book, they were talking about the militia movement. Because we did have a militia movement in the 80s.
Yeah, 70s and 80s, and then it got broken up hard by the FBI.
Yeah. And he says, well, what if there was a white militia, you know, in Kentucky or wherever, and they said, we are the John Brown militia. And so we are armed and we lived in the woods, and we swear to our dying day that we're going to protect black people from racists.
Yeah.
And our parents are racist, and their parents are racist, and they're as bad as you ever thought, and this is what we're going to do. And that very idea, interestingly enough, that's kind of what I think about the armed forces. Because when I did affirmative action plans for a Fortune 50 company, they said, we're doing ours on a GS structure the way the Army was ordered to be integrated. Yeah. And we're gonna make this a meritocracy.
Well, but the other thing,
and it's a kind of militant meritocracy.
But the other thing that happens in the military, right, is people have another identity, right? You're all green.
Yeah.
And so as a result, I think people wind up having an anchor to sort of attach to. And the people who get attracted to this shit on all sides, I think, are people who are kind of anchorless. Right? And what worries me a lot, and I've talked and written about that, and I wrote about this a long time ago, so obviously I'm smart as fuck.
Know what you're talking about.
I'm obviously smart as fuck. Was that the wave of sort of, violence and delegitimization of government from the left that we've seen in the last 25 years alarms me but doesn't frighten me. Right? And it alarms me because it opens a door, and what I think walks through that door comes from the right and is scary.
Let's talk about who the white supremacists are now. What do you perceive? What do you see that they're doing? And how are they organized? And
this is entirely bullshit put together from snippets of what I've read and seen and tied against my lived experience, right, to try and make sense of it. And what I see is a small group of people who are really devout believers in this stuff, have believed it for a long time, and are, scary. Not many of them, right? Not many of them would be willing to stand up and hold tiki torches, of all things. Fucking tiki torches. Really? This is where you're going to intimidate people with these tiki torches? Right. Citronella smelling tiki torches?
Right.
I got nothing for that.
You gotta start somewhere.
Yeah, I know. But, so, the number of people who'd go out and march in that context, and if you look at what happened in Charlottesville, right, there were 40 of those guys. These guys can't put together a demo. Well, there's a bigger group of people around them, but we'll talk about. But these groups, I've never heard or seen of them pulling together 100 people
Right.
in any of their demonstrations anywhere in the country.
Okay.
And what you have around them is you have a bunch of people who, if they lived in England, would be soccer hooligans,
Mm-hmm.
right? It's a bunch of yobs looking for a fight.
Right. Okay.
And what you get is those people scatter out on some sort of scatter plot. And some of them grew up in Portland and identify with the left and they become Antifa. Some of them, grew up in Kentucky and identify on the right and they become Proud Boys. And there's sort of the same population sifted out into a couple of buckets.
Have you heard you I don't know how long you lived in the Bay Area. Have you heard of the zebra murders?
Yeah, of course I heard about the zebra murders.
I never heard about them.
Yeah.
And I used to be a race man online. I'd get involved in all these discussions.
Yeah.
In early, maybe even pre-blog days.
Yeah.
So there's a guy named Steve Saylor.
I've heard that name.
He's associated with VDARE.
Oh, sure. Super right-wing, white nationalist.
Right.
Kind of
and
lunatic.
so it was when I was on Cafe Utney,
Yeah.
and I was a moderator for their society threads. We used to talk about that stuff all the time, and it was like as soon as somebody talked about the zebra murders, I was like, okay, I know who these guys are, and they were a constant presence. And in the bad old days of Usenet,
Right.
where there was assault culture groups and
Right.
African American, I was a fact keeper there. These guys would be there,
So
and you couldn't kick them
you
off.
couldn't give up because you know who they were.
Well, you knew what their moniker was.
Right.
Well, we had a guy named the Bard,
Yeah.
and we know what his real name was, and then we just said, we're gonna mail bomb you, and then the moderators from the Usenet host
said
you
no.
can't do
Let's
that.
back up here. Yeah.
This is free speech. So there was a time when avowed white supremacists would come to a black-oriented social group and start throwing vitriol around.
Yeah,
and
but
talking
the
stuff.
thing about that is that's part of the whole online presence thing. They wouldn't have walked into a black church and done it.
Probably not.
No, they wouldn't have. Right.
Yeah. Well,
it takes a whole different. It takes
yeah.
a whole different
That's
bundle of
true.
nerve
That's
to be
true.
able to do something like that.
That's true. That's
and
true.
so my issue is that we lower the friction with the internet, and what happens is people anchor on a bunch of different random shit. And the concern that I have is really on sort of three levels, right? One of them is that, I really don't worry about Antifa or major black riots or any of this stuff happening like in the world. We're not going to see a giant left-wing revolutionary movement rise up and sweep through the United States.
Right.
They
had their chance with Occupy.
Yeah, they had a bunch of chances. It ain't going to work. Right? Not going to happen. But what happens is you can delegitimize the government enough that you wind up with a pool of people. And the problem is the way our society works today, that pool is getting deeper and deeper and deeper by the year.
Do you think, I've heard somebody say just the other day, we need a war. Because unless we have a war, Trump is going to encourage and protect and facilitate this white nationalism.
Well, I think he does. Well, so the two problems are, one is and this is part of what I'm sort of like alerting on with this a little bit. There's a tendency on the left right now to say everything bad is racist. And the reason you say it is that it's the second worst thing you can say about someone, right? In my mind,
What's the first?
first you're a rapist,
Oh, rapist. Okay.
right?
Yeah.
You're a pedophile, you're a rapist, you're a racist.
Yeah.
In some rough order.
Mm-hmm.
And so what happens is once I say that about you, I can devalue everything you have to say. I don't have to listen to you, you're racist.
Right.
Right? There's no discussion happening between us. There's no conversation.
Right.
There's no possibility of a common ground.
Yeah.
Because I've checked that box next to your name, and from my point of view, you should
You're
be driven
done.
out of polite
You're
society.
done.
You're done.
Yeah. You're done.
Like lose your job, lose your house, lose your family.
I don't care.
Go live in the street. No, I care. I want that to happen to you.
No, I'm saying, yeah, if that happened, if your civil liberties are violated,
I'm all down with it.
so what?
Right.
Yeah.
And so what happens is we've tended to move the line really hard on what constitutes being a racist.
Mm-hmm.
And it's this interesting thing because it very much reminds me of fashion. I've always been amused by fashion, right? As obviously someone who's deeply fashionable myself.
Or fascist.
Yeah. But it's the notion that fashion changes hourly because otherwise how would the cool kids exclude everybody else?
Right. Right.
Right?
Yeah.
And it's like, oh, you're still wearing that?
Mm-hmm.
And what we've done is we've taken that same modality and we applied it to politics. Oh, you still believe that?
Right. Right.
You know, really? You still after?
Well, yeah, I guess that is part of the whole worldview of progressivism, because progressivism says whatever change takes place, it's progress.
That's right.
And if literally that's history, i.e., that's not important, and we all dismiss that and we say what happened back then was everybody hated gays.
Right.
And we were murdering 1,000 gays a week.
Right.
Back then in the bad old days. And of course, they weren't that bad.
No, well, they weren't good.
No, they weren't good.
Right, but
I can remember how long Matthew Shepard represented.
Oh, I know.
Everything.
And every time somebody brings up Matthew Shepard, I try and raise my hand and I go, it really wasn't that story, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or every time it brings up Ferguson, I'm like, you got to read the report.
Right.
And then, but by doing that, I'm making myself anti-gay and racist.
Yes, of course.
Because I'm anchored on like some kind of provable fact.
Yes.
And the issue becomes, as we move the bar and declare more and more people racist, one thing I've read, and it kind of makes sense to me, is that people are like, well, fuck it.
I'm racist.
May as well, let's go all in.
Yeah.
And now I've got this whole new identity I can attach to.
Right. And that's what the Pepe the Frog is.
Oh, right. Yes,
yeah,
yes.
Pepe
yes.
the Frog, but then again, there's still, I think, the difference between 4chan and 8chan.
Yeah.
There are places where these guys are incels, and they are so far out there that they're like, there's nothing to lose.
There's no question.
Nothing to lose.
No, well, there's no question, and I think, I've attached the term mucker to it. There's a great book called Stand on Zanzibar by John Brunner, who I believe, if I remember right, was a black science fiction writer from England in the 60s, which can't have been easy. And basically it takes place kind of now. In giant corporate world, people are relatively impoverished. Like two people who are executives both kind of have to share an apartment in New York because real estate's too expensive otherwise.
Right.
And they have supercomputers that are sort of predicting the future and modeling things. And they have what they call muckers, which are people who just lose their shit and start killing people. Right? And they talk about it like the weather.
Yeah.
Like in Houston today, there were 3 muckers.
Gotcha.
And usually they're not very sophisticated in what they do. There's a whole other layer that he hints at in the book of what he calls saboteurs.
Right.
Who are people who have actual skills, who do things like blow up monorails and sort of wipe out power stations.
That's interesting. So do you think that perhaps, I mean, let's say Trump gets elected to a second term.
Yeah, which is looking more and more likely as I'm rolling my eyes and shaking my head.
And I guess I don't really know what the Proud Boys are, and I know the guys who, what is his name, Priven, the guy from who did the standoff against the land grazing.
Oh, the family in Nevada.
Right.
The Bundy family.
Bundys, right.
Yeah.
How close do they get to terrorism, domestic terrorism?
It's an interesting question. So,
because previous to this moment, I think,
right. So the Bundy
everybody trusted the FBI to bust these guys.
So the Bundy thing was interesting, and I sort of I still spend a lot of time digesting it. If you read the record, the Bureau of Land Management was fairly fucked up in what they did. And they had a very clear intent, which is to drive these guys out of business.
Let's teach them a lesson.
No, it wasn't even, it started with, we just want this land because we believe this land should be natural terrain and shouldn't be used for grazing.
Okay.
And these people happen to be using it and they're in the way. And we're just going to shove them out of the way because we have that power because we're the federal government.
Right.
And, and then it sort of escalates and they're like, who are you to say no to us?
Right.
Kind of conversation.
Right. Don't you know?
And, at that point, things spun up really hard. And, there have been a couple cases in the States where there are these sort of interesting standoffs. I think about the one in Georgia, I think it was, where the Black World War II vets came back and basically, stood off kind of like there was a big enough, God, I gotta go find this.
Yeah, that's an interesting story.
And then there's the classic one in Athens where the World War II vets overturned a corrupt, political structure, basically by just arming up and going to town on it.
Interesting.
And so we've
Sounds
had
like something Medgar Evers would do.
yeah, but you had cases through through history where you look at the people who gunned up and went after the government, and you're like, hey, I'm not seeing this as a bad thing. Right? This is and this is one of the reasons I'm a Second Amendment supporter.
Yeah.
Is that I really believe that you need some sort of check on the government. That if there hadn't been a lot of people with rifles out that day, the Bundys would have been dragged off to jail, the ranch would have been shut down, and we never would have read about it. There'd be no story.
So let's swing back around.
But let me go back to your point about how close does it become to terrorism.
Yeah.
I think there's an interesting question about what Trump's going to do, and I tend to break Trump up into kind of two tracks. There's what Trump says and what Trump does.
Yeah.
Because as a real estate developer, I was a real estate banker for a number of years, and I dealt with a lot of developers, and these guys absolutely two-tracked the world. Blah 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 blah. Look at the hand while I do this.
Right. I believe that.
Right, and that's how they make their money. That's how they make the deals they make that make them rich. And Trump does that to the nth degree.
Naturally.
Well, it's who he is.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, he says an amazing amount of stupid shit.
True.
He doesn't do a lot of stupid shit that I've seen yet. Right? It's like I'm talking to my left friends. I'm like, how do you reconcile criminal justice reform with Trump being a horrible racist? Right? How do you reconcile those things? Like
Kanye West.
Well, whatever. Like he got talked into it. I mean, and somebody who's a real racist says there are black super predators and they need to be locked in jail forever.
Right.
And that was the Clintons, as I recall.
Or Kamala Harris.
Right. Yeah. Let's not talk about her. Don't get me started. And so what you get is this notion of a Trump who lives in this cloud of ugly words.
Right.
But I have a hard time picturing him, sort of like revving up the Proud Boys to go after his political opponents.
Right. Well, that's kind of like the owner of the Clippers, right?
Yeah. And to me, that's a bright line.
The previous owner
of the Clippers, not Ballmer. I remember.
Right.
Sterling. But that's a bright line, right? The point where Trump does more than shit talk at rallies, and where you start seeing Proud Boys going after kind of left people who aren't Antifa.
Right.
Right. To me, Antifa are street fighters out there looking for a fight.
And the interesting thing is, when the Berkeley riots were happening, I was following the stickmen.
Yeah, but see,
and I was like, these stickmen, they're dangerous.
But let's remember,
but they haven't shown up again.
Well, but what happened was, right? But they have, right? That those folks morphed into the Proud Boys. Those folks have morphed into these groups that are fighting Antifa.
Okay.
And this was kind of my argument at the time was, and I'm glad you remember this. Antifa riots against Milo and other right-wing speakers.
Right.
Right. They make it real clear that they're just going to shut this shit down.
Right.
And that anybody that argues with them is going to take a beating. And so this one crazy guy with the shield and the stick, stickman or something like
stickman, that's right.
Shows up, right, and goes at it with them, and he gets arrested and hauled away. Right. Because the cops are like, we can arrest one of him or 30 of them. Let's take him. Right. And and so this is all kind of a reaction to the door that got opened by Antifa. And so the problem is, if you look at German history, which is the thing everyone looks at right now, because we of course are going to become a Nazi power in 30 years. You had super crazy street violence from the left wing. I think it was SPDR, that was looking to basically trigger a communist revolution in Germany. Right. The brown shirts showed up. They got the shit beat out of them a few times. Right. That in turn partially is what led to Hitler wind up winning office. At which point he empowered them and they beat the shit out of everybody.
I'm thinking about Rodney King, and I'm thinking about Freddie Gray because they kicked off riots.
Yeah.
And here we had Koreans with with rifles on top of it, and they were ready.
Oh yeah.
But that has not happened again.
We haven't had the scale of public violence that we had.
And you and I have lived through 1968, 1969, and it's not even come close to that.
And I think part of the reason for that is, and here I'm stepping out of my lane, right, and into yours. But I gotta believe that if I'm a median member of the black community in LA in 1968, my life prospects look a whole lot different than they do if I'm a median member of the black community living in LA in 2019.
Right.
That the black community is kind of fractionated. I had a friend of mine who lived in Watts talked for a long time about what happened when they lifted the restrictive covenants on land ownership in California, which was that all the middle class black people moved away.
Oh yeah.
Right? Because they could, all of a sudden, they could buy land in this neighborhood.
Yeah.
They could buy land in Beverly Hills. They could buy land anywhere.
Right.
And so they're like, I don't want to live in Watts. I want to live in the Palisades.
Yeah.
And the problem is you wind up with this residual group of people who were the poorest, lowest social capital, kind of least able to cope in the world people, who kind of got left behind.
Yep.
And what's interesting to me, and I've had fun with this with some of my more white nationalist, more right wing friends, is as we've seen the aggregate decline in the lower middle class in America, what we're seeing is more and more white people who are sociologically indistinguishable from them. Right? We're seeing meth addicts instead of crack addicts. We're seeing hoes and pimps.
The poor kids can do as well as the white kids.
God, Biden, I gave you money, dude. I didn't give you money to make these kind of idiot mistakes.
Yeah, that's what we think of Lake Elsinore and the Antelope Valley.
Yeah.
It's just those are the Badlands.
But what's happening is that what was once considered a unique pathology of the black community, and somehow associated with blackness.
I think that happened after the war. World War. I mean, I used to think about everybody got a reset during the Depression.
Right.
All right. Everybody was broke.
Yep.
Everybody was standing in line for bread.
Yep.
And it was, can you help a brother? There was hobos. And I don't think even the racism of the heyday of the White Citizens Council and the KKK survived that.
I think that's part of what washed it away.
Right.
I think that that's a piece. I think that racism at that level is a luxury, and when you're not materially well off enough to afford luxuries, I got other things to do. I got to feed my family.
Right.
And if a black guy's going to give me a job, I'm going to tip my hat and eat.
So I think we should close in that conclusion, because I guess the poorer that America gets, and the more real it has to get, and the closer to war America gets, and poverty, that people won't have time to sit around online pointing fingers and.
But see, let me flip it around. The people out in the real world are nowhere close to war.
Right.
The people in the real world. There's actually was a Pew study on this, right? They perceive less and less racial difference and less racial animosity,
and more interracial marriages.
And more interracial marriages. Everyone's going to wind up looking like me, I want to point out, in about 50 years, which is a shame.
I think our hair will look better.
Yeah. Damn it. But the people who think the world is worse off are the people who are highly online. And so what we're going to have is a war among the Twitterati with the people in the real world looking on going, what the hell are you people doing?
Fear of falling.
Whatever.
Yeah.
So hopefully they won't dent too many people's heads in the process. That's my hope.
How's the Dignity book coming?
I love it. I've finished it. I think it's an awesome book. I think, there's a couple threads in it that I would take out. He's overtly political about some stuff that I think he's dumb to be political about, because it narrows the audience for the book.
Yeah.
But the book is a terrific kind of eye-opening look at it. There's a quote I pulled.
Want to put this one against the woman who
Nickel and Dime?
Nickel and Dime.
Well, I pull this against Nickel and Dime any day.
Okay.
Book, awesome.
All right.
There's a quote in it that I want to sort of leave by, which is by a young black woman he meets in Cairo, Illinois. And I'm going to get the quote wrong, but I'll get the gist of it right. Mm-hmm. And she says everything left. Basically that when the plants closed, a black mayor came in, and it kind of all at the same time, all the white people just fled. And they were left with nothing but the ghetto of the city and the people who'd lived in the ghetto, and everybody else moved out. And she says, we're smart. We can work. We can make things and do things. There's just nothing here for us to work on or do. And I think that's kind of the foundational point we ought to take away, which is
new Rust Belts.
Well, it's not the new Rust Belts, but that everybody ought to remember that kind of everybody you deal with is that person and has that potential.
Yeah.
And the question is, we need the potential. We need the human capital in our society.
We do.
We can't throw it away.
Absolutely.
So,
No more AI. Give
yeah,
people
good luck
jobs.
on that.
Let's thank our audience.
Hey, thank you, audience.
Thanks, guys.
Both of you.
See you next time. Thank you for listening to American Wag. That's good.
Yeah, it's all right.
Join us again, won't you?
You and I ramble a lot. Neither of us is a very directed speaker, but that's kind of okay.